In the busy London courthouse, Judge Edward Thompson adjusted his robes and looked down at his schedule. Monday mornings were always the busiest, filled with weekend infractions and minor violations. 20 years on the bench had made him efficient, but sometimes rigid. The wooden gavel felt familiar in his hand as he called the next case. "Victoria Bennett parking violation," announced the clerk, a thin man with glasses perched on his nose. The courtroom was quiet as a well-dressed woman in her 50s approached the stand. She wore a simple but elegant navy suit, and her hair was pulled back neatly. Her posture was confident, her eyes direct and calm. She carried a leather briefcase and stood with the dignity of someone who knew her own worth. Judge Thompson barely looked up from the paperwork. These minor violations rarely required much thought. "Ms. Bennett, you parked in an emergency zone outside St. Mary's Hospital last Tuesday at 2:15 p.m. The fine is $200, he stated flatly. Victoria placed her briefcase on the small table before her. "Your Honor, if I may explain the circumstances." The judge nodded curtly, already thinking about the next case. "I'm a doctor at St. Mary's. I was off duty but received an emergency call. A child had been brought in with a severe allergic reaction, and I was the nearest specialist available. I did try to park properly, but there were no spaces and the child's condition was critical." Judge Thompson frowned slightly. He had heard every excuse imaginable over his long career. People always had reasons for breaking rules. "Do you have proof of this emergency?" he asked, his tone suggesting he doubted her story. "I can provide hospital records, Your Honor, though they would take time to obtain officially. My hospital ID is here." She reached into her briefcase. The judge waved, his hand dismissively. "The law applies to everyone, Ms. Bennett. Emergency vehicles have proper identification and authorization. As a doctor, you should know better than to park in spaces reserved for ambulances." A few people in the courtroom shifted uncomfortably. Victoria's expression remained composed, though something flickered briefly in her eyes. "With respect, Your Honor, the child might have died had I taken the time to find proper parking. Sometimes human life must take precedence. The rules exist precisely to ensure emergency services can reach those in need," Judge Thompson interrupted. "Your actions could have blocked a genuine emergency vehicle." The courtroom was silent. Judge Thompson noticed a young reporter in the back scribbling notes, and it only strengthened his resolve. He couldn't appear to bend the rules, even for a doctor. "The fine stands at $200. Please see the clerk for payment details." Victoria Bennett looked at him for a long moment. There was no anger in her gaze, just a thoughtful assessment that somehow made him feel more uncomfortable than outrage would have. "Very well, Your Honor. I accept your ruling." She paid the fine without further comment and walked out of the courtroom with her head held high. Several people watched her go, including an older man who shook his head slightly. Judge Thompson called the next case, pushing the incident from his mind. By lunchtime, he had forgotten Victoria Bennett entirely. That evening, he drove home to his quiet house in the suburbs. His wife Mary had dinner waiting, a simple roast with potatoes and vegetables. They ate mostly in silence, as had become their habit after 30 years of marriage. "Busy day?" Mary asked, passing him the salt. "The usual," he replied. "Nothing remarkable." After dinner, he settled into his favorite armchair with the newspaper while Mary watched her programs. The television hummed in the background until a name caught his attention. "The Prime Minister today announced Victoria Bennett as nominee for Chief Justice of the Supreme Court," the news presenter said. Edward Thompson looked up sharply. The newspaper slipped from his fingers as the camera showed the same dignified woman who had stood in his courtroom just hours earlier. "Dr. Victoria Bennett has served as an appeals court judge for the past decade. Following her distinguished career in both medicine and law," the reporter continued enthusiastically. The teacup Mary had just handed him froze halfway to his lips. The woman he had fined and dismissed without a second thought was one of the most respected legal minds in the country. What had he done? Edward Thompson couldn't tear his eyes away from the television. The reporter continued speaking about Victoria Bennett, showing footage of her receiving awards and working with children in hospitals. Dr. Bennett is particularly known for her groundbreaking work in medical ethics law. She has argued 7 major cases before the Supreme Court and has written 3 books on the intersection of medicine and justice, the reporter said. Mary noticed her husband's strange expression. Edward, are you all right? You look like you've seen a ghost. He couldn't find words immediately. The room felt suddenly hot and uncomfortable. That woman, the one they're talking about, she was in my courtroom today. For a parking ticket, Mary sat down beside him, curious. The next Chief Justice had a parking ticket? Yes, Edward said quietly. And I fined her the maximum amount. I didn't even properly listen to her explanation. The news segment showed Victoria Bennett speaking at a conference. Her voice was clear and thoughtful as she discussed the importance of compassion within the framework of law. Justice without empathy is merely punishment, she said on the screen. The law must breathe with humanity. Edward felt each word like a personal rebuke. He remembered how quickly he had dismissed her, how he hadn't even looked properly at her. Hospital ID. Mary touched his arm. You were just doing your job, following the rules. But Edward knew it was more than that. He hadn't treated Victoria Bennett the way he treated other defendants. He had been colder, more dismissive. Had it been because she was a woman? Because of her race? Or just because he was having a bad day and she had become an easy target? I need some air, he said, rising suddenly. Outside in the garden, the cool evening breeze did little to settle his thoughts. Edward sat on the old wooden bench and replayed the court appearance in his mind. He had interrupted her explanation. He'd assumed she was making excuses. Worse, he realized he hadn't given her the respect he typically showed to male professionals who appeared in his court. His phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a message from his colleague, Judge William Porter. Did you see the news? Wasn't that Bennett woman in your court this morning? Talk about awkward timing. Edward put the phone away without answering. This wasn't about timing or awkwardness. This was about something far more uncomfortable, confronting his own biases. He spent a restless night tossing and turning. Mary slept peacefully beside him, but Edward kept seeing Victoria Bennett's calm, dignified face as he dismissed her explanation. At 5 a.m., he gave up on sleep and went to his home office. With trembling fingers, he typed her name into his computer. Dozens of results appeared. Articles about her legal career, her medical work, interviews where she spoke about justice reform. One article described how she had given up a lucrative, private practice to work on cases for disadvantaged children. Another detailed her work establishing medical clinics in underserved communities. Everything he read showed a woman of exceptional intelligence and integrity. By the time Mary brought him coffee at 7 a.m., Edward's desk was covered in printed articles. What are you going to do? She asked quietly. The right thing, he answered, though I'm not exactly sure what that is yet. At the courthouse that morning, Edward went straight to his clerk, Robert. I need to see the video recording from yesterday's session, particularly the Bennett case. Robert raised an eyebrow but knew better than to question a judge's request. In the privacy of his chambers, Edward watched himself on screen. The evidence was painful to witness. His tone had been condescending. He had barely looked at Victoria Bennett as she spoke. He had cut her off mid-explanation. This isn't who I want to be, he whispered to himself. After his morning cases, Edward made a decision. He called Victoria Bennett's office, his heart pounding as her assistant answered. This is Judge Edward Thompson. I need to speak with Dr. Bennett about a personal matter. There was a pause. Dr. Bennett is extremely busy with the nomination process, the assistant said coolly. I understand. Please tell her I wish to apologize for my conduct yesterday. I would appreciate a few minutes of her time whenever she might be available. Another pause. I'll pass along your message, Judge Thompson. Edward hung up, feeling both relieved and anxious. He didn't expect her to respond, and perhaps she shouldn't. What could he possibly say to make things right? To his surprise, his phone rang 30 minutes later. Judge Thompson, this is Victoria Bennett. I understand you called. The sound of Victoria Bennett's voice on the phone made Edward's heart race. He had not expected her to call back so quickly, if at all. "Dr. Bennett, thank you for returning my call," Edward said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I wanted to speak with you about yesterday's hearing." "Yes, I thought you might," Victoria replied. Her tone was neither angry nor cold, simply matter-of-fact. Edward took a deep breath. "I believe I owe you an apology. My conduct was not appropriate." There was a brief silence before Victoria spoke again. "I appreciate that, Judge Thompson. These conversations are not easy." "Would it be possible to meet in person?" Edward asked. "I would prefer not to have this discussion over the phone." To his surprise, Victoria agreed. "I can see you tomorrow at 2 p.m. at my office. I have a short window between meetings." After they hung up, Edward sat at his desk feeling both relieved and nervous. The next day seemed both too far away and too soon. That night he barely touched his dinner. Mary noticed his distraction. "You're meeting her tomorrow?" she asked. Edward nodded. "I'm not sure what I'll say." "The truth is usually a good place to start," Mary suggested gently. The next morning, Edward requested something he had never asked for before, a copy of all his case decisions from the past year. He wanted to see if there was a pattern to his judgments. The court clerk looked surprised but gathered the files. Edward spent hours reviewing case after case, making notes. What he found disturbed him. In cases involving professionals like himself, older white men, he showed more leniency and patience. With others, particularly women and minorities, he was more likely to apply the maximum penalties and less likely to consider mitigating circumstances. The evidence of his own bias was right there in black and white. Edward felt sick to his stomach. Attack. 1:30 p.m. He left for Victoria Bennett's office. The building was impressive, a modern structure in central London housing several legal practices. Victoria's office was on the top floor. Her assistant, a young man with a serious expression, led Edward to a waiting area. "Dr. Bennett will be with you shortly." The office walls were lined with framed degrees and awards. A large photograph showed Victoria shaking hands with the Queen. Another showed her receiving an award from the World Health Organization. "Judge Thompson," Victoria's voice came from behind him. She stood in the doorway of her inner office, dressed in a simple but elegant gray suit. "Dr. Bennett, thank you for seeing me," Edward said, standing quickly. "Please come in." She gestured to her office, a spacious room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. They sat across from each other at a small conference table, rather than with her behind her desk. It felt more equal that way, and Edward appreciated the gesture. "I've been reviewing my court records," Edward began. "I wanted to understand if what happened in your case was an isolated incident or part of a pattern." Victoria watched him carefully, her expression neutral. "What I found disturbs me greatly," he continued. "There is clear evidence that I have not been as fair or impartial as I believed myself to be." "Most of us aren't," Victoria said quietly. "That's the first difficult truth to accept." Edward nodded. "In your case specifically, I dismissed your explanation without proper consideration. I didn't show you the respect you deserved, not just as a distinguished professional, but as any person appearing in my courtroom." Victoria leaned forward slightly. "May I ask what prompted this reflection, Judge Thompson? Was it discovering my nomination?" The question was direct, and Edward felt his face grow warm. "Yes," he admitted, "and I'm not proud of that. It shouldn't have taken learning about your position to make me examine my behavior." To his surprise, Victoria smiled, slightly. "But it did, and now you're here. That's more than many would do." She rose and walked to the window. "Throughout my career, I've experienced moments like the one in your courtroom. Small dismissals, assumptions, having to work twice as hard to receive half the recognition." She turned back to face him. "Those experiences shaped my determination to reform our courts." Edward felt both ashamed and strangely hopeful. "I want to do better," he said simply. "Then perhaps," Victoria said, "this unfortunate incident can become something meaningful after all." Victoria walked back to the conference table and sat down across from Edward. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, casting a warm, glow across the room. "Judge Thompson, may I ask you something personal?" she said. Edward nodded, feeling uncertain but committed to this difficult conversation. "When did you last attend any judicial bias training?" Edward thought for a moment. "There was a mandatory seminar about 5 years ago. I attended, of course, but you didn't think it applied to you," Victoria finished gently. "I suppose I didn't," Edward admitted. "I've always prided myself on being fair. I grew up with little money. My father worked in a factory. I thought I understood struggle." Victoria poured water from a pitcher into 2 glasses. "Understanding one kind of struggle doesn't automatically grant understanding of all others." She handed him a glass. "Did you know I grew up not far from here? My father was a bus driver, my mother a school cook. Every step of my journey has been filled with people assuming I didn't belong." Edward took a sip of water, suddenly aware of how dry his mouth had become. "How do you not become bitter?" Victoria thought for a moment. "Some days I do feel bitter, but more often I feel determined. Each barrier I've faced has only strengthened my resolve to create a better system." She reached into a drawer and pulled out a thin folder. "I have something for you. It's a study we conducted last year on unconscious bias in sentencing. The results might interest you." Edward took the folder, feeling a strange mix of shame and gratitude. "What do you think I should do now?" he asked honestly. Victoria smiled slightly. "You're a judge, Judge Thompson. You're used to giving orders, not taking them." Edward laughed, nervously. "You're right, but I'm asking for your guidance." Victoria stood up and walked to her bookshelf. "When I face a difficult ethical question, I often think of something my grandmother used to say. When you know better, you do better." She turned to look at him. "You now know better. The question is, what will you do with that knowledge?" Edward thought about the court records he had reviewed that morning, the clear pattern of bias in his decisions. "I want to start a program," he said slowly, the idea forming as he spoke. "Something in our district to identify and address unconscious bias. Not just a one-time training, but ongoing review and reflection." Victoria's eyes lit up with interest. "That could be valuable work. Would you—" Edward hesitated. "Would you be willing to advise on such a program? I understand if that's not appropriate given your nomination." Victoria considered his request. "I believe in the importance of such work. Let me think about how I might contribute appropriately." She glanced at her watch. "I'm afraid I have another meeting soon." Edward stood quickly. "Of course, thank you for seeing me, Dr. Bennett." As he turned to leave, Victoria spoke again. "Judge Thompson, may I make an observation?" He turned back. "Please do." "The hardest person to judge fairly is oneself," she said. "What you've done today took courage." Edward felt a weight lift from his shoulders. "Thank you for your graciousness, Dr. Bennett." As he left her office building, Edward felt both humbled and inspired. The busy London street seemed different somehow, as if he was seeing it through new eyes. That evening, he told Mary everything that had happened. "I'm proud of you," she said, squeezing his hand. "I'm not sure I deserve to feel good about this," Edward admitted. "I should never have behaved that way in the first place." Mary considered this. "True growth isn't about feeling good, Edward. It's about becoming better." The next morning, Edward arrived at court early. He asked his clerk to schedule a meeting with the district's administrative judge. "May I ask what it's regarding?" Robert asked. "Yes," Edward said with new resolve. "I want to propose a judicial review program. I believe we have work to do." Over the following weeks, Edward immersed himself in research about bias in the legal system. He read books and studies, including the one Victoria had given him. The findings were eye-opening and sometimes uncomfortable. He began paying careful attention to his own reactions in court, catching himself when he made assumptions or showed impatience. It wasn't easy work, but it felt necessary and right. 1 month after their meeting, Edward received a note from Victoria. "I've been following your proposal for a judicial review program. I'd like to meet again to discuss how I might support this important work. Sometimes the most meaningful changes come from unexpected beginnings." Victoria Bennett. Edward smiled as he read her words. From an uncomfortable truth had come the possibility of real change, not just for himself but perhaps for the entire system. 6 months had passed since that fateful day in Edward's courtroom. The morning was crisp and clear as he dressed, carefully in his best suit. Today was Victoria Bennett's swearing-in ceremony as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. "You look nervous," Mary commented as she straightened his tie. "I am," Edward admitted. "This is a historic day." The grand hall was filled with important people, politicians, judges, lawyers, and journalists. Edward found his seat among the guests, feeling both out of place and privileged to witness this moment. The ceremony began with speeches from various dignitaries. Edward listened politely, but his mind kept returning to his journey over these past months. His judicial review program had started small, just 5 judges in his district willing to examine their own decisions and discuss patterns they found. At first, the conversations had been uncomfortable. No one liked to admit they might be biased. But gradually, the discussions had become more honest and productive. Victoria had been quietly supportive, offering suggestions through carefully worded notes and sending relevant research. Despite her busy schedule with the nomination process, she had never forgotten their shared project. Edward's attention returned to the present as Victoria entered the hall. She looked solemn and dignified in her formal robes. As she took her oath of office, her voice rang clear and confident through the hall. "I do solemnly swear that I will administer justice without respect to persons, and do equal right to the poor and to the rich." Edward felt a lump in his throat. These ancient words held new meaning for him now. After the ceremony, there was a reception with small groups of people talking quietly. Edward stayed toward the back, not wanting to intrude, on Victoria's special day. He was surprised when she made her way through the crowd toward him. "Judge Thompson," she said warmly, "I'm so glad you could come." "I wouldn't have missed it, Chief Justice," he replied. "Congratulations," Victoria smiled. "I've heard excellent things about your program. 3 other districts have adopted similar initiatives, I'm told." Edward felt a surge of pride. "It's just the beginning. We have more work to do." "Yes," she agreed. "But beginnings matter." A photographer approached. "Chief Justice, could we get a picture of you with Judge Thompson?" Victoria looked at Edward questioningly. He nodded, and they stood side by side for the photograph. "For the court newsletter," the photographer explained. "We're doing a piece on your judicial review program." After he left, Victoria turned to Edward. "Your program is making a difference. People are talking about it, thinking about how they make decisions." "It's our program," Edward corrected gently. "It wouldn't exist without you." Victoria shook her head. "No, Edward. You did the hard work. I merely offered some guidance." An aide approached, whispering that the Prime Minister wanted to speak with Victoria. "I must go," she said. "But I wanted to tell you something. Next month, I'm establishing a National Judicial Ethics Committee. I'd like you to serve on it." Edward was stunned. "Me? But I'm just a local judge." Victoria's eyes were kind but serious. "You're exactly who we need. Someone who understands that recognizing our failures can lead to our greatest contributions." As she walked away, Edward felt a deep sense of purpose. The mistake that had brought him such shame had become the catalyst for meaningful change. That evening, Edward and Mary walked through the park near their home. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of pink and gold. "I still can't believe it," Edward said. "Me, on a national committee." Mary squeezed his hand. "I can believe it. You did something rare, Edward. When confronted with your own failings, you didn't make excuses. You decided to change." Edward thought about how differently things might have gone. He could have ignored his discomfort, defended his actions, or simply apologized without making any real changes. "You know what Victoria said to me today?" He told Mary. "She said recognizing our failures can lead to our greatest contributions." Mary nodded thoughtfully. "She's a wise woman." They continued their walk in comfortable silence. Edward reflected on how one moment, one uncomfortable truth acknowledged, had transformed not just his career but his understanding of justice itself. The judicial system wasn't perfect, because the people who ran it weren't perfect. But recognizing that imperfection was the first step towards something better. As twilight settled over London, Edward Thompson felt a quiet certainty that his most important work as a judge was just beginning. The true measure of justice wasn't in never making mistakes. It was in how you responded when those mistakes came to light.